Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, we welcome you to this year's seminar on the topic, the board secretary as a gatekeeper to the board, current trends. My name is Fred Aite, the CEO of Institute of Directors Ghana, as I indicated earlier. We have today, as the chair and moderator for the function, Lady Reverend Mrs. Angela Carmen Appiah, Fellow of the Institute of Directors Ghana, and then also the Vice President of the Institute. At this stage, I would yield the time to the Vice President of the Institute of Directors Ghana, Lady Reverend Mrs. Angela Carmen Appiah, who also sits as our moderator. Lady Reverend, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aite. Good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. We sincerely apologize for the late start of this afternoon's session. We thank the leadership of the Institute for another great opportunity for us to share knowledge and to network. It is my singular honor once again to moderate this afternoon's session. And by way of expectation, we will have our opening prayer, followed by some few administrative directives. Our speaker will be introduced, and then we'll have about 45 minutes of presentation time, which will be followed by an interactive session. Then we should be getting ready to close. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for the opportunities you give us to take stock of the wealth that you have given us. We pray that as we come to sharpen the swords you have given us, you give us an ability not just to wield sharpened swords, but also to apply them appropriately. We thank you for answered prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. By way of administrative directives, please note that you'll be given an opportunity to ask questions and to share your thinking. Those who would like to write to may feel free to engage us using the chat spaces, and I'll read out your comments at the right time. Without wasting much time, may I humbly invite back to join us Mr. Aite to introduce our special speaker for this afternoon's seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. This afternoon we have as our main speaker, Madam Sandra Thompson, the Secretary, Bank of Ghana. She's an expert in legal and justice sector reforms and the transformation and modernization of public sector institutions, specializing in legal policy, access to justice, rule of law, project and program management, human rights, and administrative justice issues. She has over 20 years experience as a lawyer, studied private sector practice, academia, and government business. She has several years experience public sector at senior levels in positions that bridge law and development policy and theory with practice. Through engagement and advocacy with government, ministries, departments, and agencies, bilateral and multilateral agencies, development partners, donors, academia, and civil society. She's highly experienced in public sector governance and in the management of large government institutions with expertise in public sector reforms in general. She has led the implementation of several flagship judicial and justice sector reform activities and programs in Ghana that have set benchmarks in the West African sub-region, and has held strategic and advisory roles on the implementation of similar projects to governments in the West Africa sub-region. She has a proven record for doing so for the judiciary of Ghana, where she rendered meritorious service to 2 Honorable Chief Justices of the Republic. She has also served ministers of justice and attorney generals in Ghana, the government of Sierra Leone, under DFID funded access to justice and security programs and to the government of Nigeria as well. As I had indicated, she is currently the secretary to the Central Bank of Ghana, a role which she is central and pivotal to the operations of the bank. He previously served as the general counsel of the bank and the director and head of the legal department of the Bank of Ghana. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you our special speaker for today's seminar, Madam Sandra Thompson. Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I yield time back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aite. And before a speaker starts her presentation, we would like to know, how sharp are our blades? Where are the knowledge gaps? Do you have performance gaps? Are there gray areas? What kind of muscles should a board secretary have? What does the Act 992, Act 2019 say about board secretaries? To do this for us and many more, may we receive our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lady Reverend Angela Carmen Appiah, Vice President of the IoD. I acknowledge Mr. Fred Aite, the hardworking CEO of the IoD. Also with us is Professor John Bright Aheto, who is Chair of the Educational Capacity Development and Research Committee and a council member of the IoD. Also with us is Professor Albert Puni, the Vice Chair and of the Educational Capacity Development and Research Committee, and also a council member of the IoD. It is an honor and a privilege to be asked by the IoD to give this presentation at this afternoon's seminar, and I count it an honor to be a member, and a privilege actually, to be a member of the Institute of Directors in Ghana. I cherish my relationship with the Institute for the untold benefits, the countless benefits that yields to being a member. I acknowledge all members who have joined us this afternoon. I acknowledge fellows who are with us this afternoon, and I thank all our invited guests who have taken the time to join us for this presentation. The topic I have been asked to speak on is the board secretary as gatekeeper to the board. And the Institute has asked me to speak on current trends. And so if you give me a minute, I will share my screen and then we can commence the presentation. In the few minutes that I have been given, I'll speak to the role of the board secretary. I want to look at some historical antecedents and the origin of the board secretary. Then we will look at, seeing that the topic is current trends, I want to look at the traditional role of the board secretary and then how it has evolved. In the course of the presentation, I will examine briefly the concept of the gatekeeper within corporate governance rules, and then the gatekeeping role of the board secretary vis-a-vis the New Companies Act, the Act 992. We'll look at a few current trends and key activities, and then we'll end with qualities and a few soft skills to succeed as a gatekeeper, and then we'll pull it to a conclusion. So in defining, I will say that the board secretary is primarily an officer who assists and guides and advises the company's board of directors in their pursuit of the company's aims and objectives and articles of association. The proper functioning of any modern day institution depends on good corporate governance, and good corporate governance itself depends on gatekeepers who will serve the board of directors and the company with honesty, with integrity, and with independence to protect the interests of the company, its shareholders, its employees, and its stakeholders. The company secretary or the board secretary is at once an employee and an officer of the company, as well as the gatekeeper, and he's tasked with giving independent advice on regulatory matters, on corporate governance matters, and on legal matters. And he must do this or strive to do this as independently as possible and with integrity. Yet we see that the 21st century board secretary is a new creation, and the role itself has evolved to take into account the modern rigors of the current demands of stakeholders on the board of directors and the heightened fiduciary role of directors under the new Act, Companies Act 992. Its historical antecedents, therefore, are as follows. The company secretary is an ancient corporate invention, and the office itself has continued to today to enhance transparency and to facilitate board independence. It is described in many of the laws I have seen and defined simply as an officer of the company and as an advisor to the board. The role is not clerical or secretarial as such. Board secretaries or company secretaries are not executives or administrative assistants. Neither are they assistants to the board chair. Instead, they are independent, or they should be independent individuals. They could also well be a corporate body, because there are institutions that offer company secretarial services, and you could hire them to come and function as such within your corporation. But mostly there will be, or mainly there will be, an individual carrying out a very senior professional role within an institution or an organization. Despite its role, therefore, company secretaries are not assistants to chairmen, and they are not executive assistants. They are individuals. The nomenclature varies depending on which jurisdiction you are in. Already you have seen that I have referred interchangeably between company secretary, board secretary. So how does it arise? This English invention of the corporate officer has been exported notably to other common law jurisdictions, such as Canada, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and even the Commonwealth of Africa. China, being a civil law country, has also installed the statutory officer in their company structure. And so the term company secretary is commonly used in the United Kingdom and in the Commonwealth countries. Our law, the Company Law Act, the Act 992, refers to the company secretary, and other laws refer to the company secretary. In the United States, in Canada, in Eastern Europe, and some of the post-Soviet states, the term corporate secretary is more common. Another term that is commonly used is board secretary, and that is the term that we will be using for this presentation. But mainly it is one and the same thing. The secretary, the company or the board secretary, I want to tell you a little bit about my particular role as the secretary to the bank. And in my case, the secretary's position is prescribed by law, which is the Bank of Ghana Act, the Act 2002, Act 612 as amended, which states that there shall be an officer named the secretary. In section 21 of the Act, it states that the bank shall have an officer designated the secretary, who shall be appointed by the board to perform the functions of maintaining a secretariat for the board, and to etc., 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 and to perform other such functions as the governor or the board may direct. For this reason, for us, we use the nomenclature as the secretary, and that is what we use at the central bank, although some will call their board secretaries the secretary, various other nomenclature, as I have said. Solicitor secretary is what I was trying to remember, and so forth and so on. The person is appointed by the board, And this is so because you would have heard me stressing and emphasizing the point of the independence. And that is the reason why the person is appointed by the board collectively, so that they are able to stand alone or aside from the executive. And in the bank, it is one of only 3 positions appointed by the board per the Bank of Ghana Act, the other 2 being the internal auditor and the head of banking supervision. And so those other functions have extended over the decades at the bank. And so today the secretary supports not only the board, but supports the management of the bank and the general administration of the bank, and all 22 departments of the bank and the 6 regional offices, including the bank's external stakeholders, the executive, the judiciary, parliament, the controller and accountant general, and so forth and so on. The role has extended, as I have said, and for the sake of this presentation, I'm required to focus on the secretary as the board secretary and the relationship between that role and being a gatekeeper. And so I shall do just that. Excuse me. I want to look at the traditional role then of the board secretary. So traditionally, the board secretary was seen at worst as a minute taker and at best as the chief administrator of the company. The role was heavily slanted towards ensuring regulatory compliance and corporate records administration. And so usually you will see that the company secretary or the board secretary is referred to as the chief record keeper and the custodian of the seal. Some of the traditional duties of the board secretary includes issuing notices, the ones that people are conversant with, ensuring the accurate recording of minutes at board meetings and board committee meetings, and then recording the decisions. The board secretary is the custodian of the decisions of the meeting, as well as communicating those decisions, drafting resolutions, filing statutory documents, and so forth and so on. For this reason, for many years, the board secretary has been seen as being a mere administrator or an auxiliary to the proceedings and the conduct of board meetings. In Ghana, the role of the board secretary has been legislated under Section 212 of the Companies Act 2019, which is the Act 992, and includes the following. Under the Act, it says that the company secretary shall manage board meetings and committee meetings, shall manage shareholder engagement activities, including annual general meetings, carry out board instructions, implement board decisions, keep the share registers and other important registers up to date, make sure that the registers are compliant with the laws. They are to provide advice to the board of directors on corporations lists, on listing rules and constitutional requirements. They are to ensure that the company is adhering to its compliance obligations, such as the requirements for continuous disclosure. And so it is under this requirement that we have to serve our annual report, the Bank of Ghana annual report, serve it to the minister and to Parliament, for example, through the minister to Parliament. And our financial statements must be served through the minister to Parliament and published. This is the requirement. The law enshrines or enjoins the secretary to make sure that this process of continuous disclosure has been made. Engage regulators and other third parties, such as the external auditors, assist the board to comply with the constitution of the company and with any relevant enactment, keep the books and the records for the company, ensure that the minutes of the proceedings of board meetings and of shareholders meetings are properly recorded in a form prescribed by the Act, prepare and issue notices in the name of the company, ensure that the annual financial statements of the company are dispatched to every person entitled to those statements as required by law, ensure that all the statutory forms and returns are duly filed with the registrar, maintain the statutory registers of the company, provide the board with guidance as to duties, responsibilities, and powers of the board, and on the changes and developments in the laws affecting the operations. The duties are manifold, it goes on, but you'll see down the slide advising the directors on their responsibilities as directors, communicating with the company shareholders or external stakeholders, maintaining the statutory registers and keeping the safe custody, making of the company seal and making sure that the decisions taken by the board are not only communicated properly, but are complied with appropriately. It appears that the English courts themselves, who brought to us this whole officer, this notion of the corporate officer themselves, viewed the role as purely administrative and clerical. And so in an ancient case that I found, the case of Barnett, Hawes and Co. versus South London Tramways, this is an 1887 case, the judges made some very dismissive comments, and I have picked it out in an effort to juxtapose the old attitude of the board secretary towards the new attitude. And there they said, this is the decision of the judges in that case. A secretary is a mere servant. His position is that he is to do what he is told, and no person can assume that he has any authority to represent anything at all, nor can anyone assume that statements made by him are necessary to be accepted as trustworthy without further inquiry. It is instructive to note that this decision of the court was for many years followed. The ratio of the court, as we call it in law, was followed by many companies, in fact, countries and nations for many years. So if this is the old attitude or the old positioning of the board secretary, then I'd like us now to look at the evolving role of the modern day board secretary or company secretary. Despite the legal installation of this office, the board secretary's function as corporate gatekeeper has traditionally not been discussed at all. Normally, when corporations speak about gatekeeping, they refer to the role of the auditors or the gatekeeping role of compliance officers and even of lawyers. Although I have to say that nowadays most board secretaries will also be lawyers. The role of the board secretary has, however, evolved since those days from being a mere secretary, as the judges stated in the ancient case, or an assistant to the chairman, to become a statutory officer who assumes managerial functions as the advisor to the board. They are a creation now of statute, and statute itself prescribes their duties clearly without equivocation. Contemporary governance, compliance, and board effectiveness of the secretary. So current trends show us that the role has now come to include a range of compliance, advisory, and strategic functions. The company secretary now plays an important role in supporting the effectiveness of the board by monitoring and ensuring that board policies, board regulations, board programs and activities and procedures are implemented, not only followed, but more importantly for me, are implemented. So increasingly, we are beginning to see a shift from the note taker or the minute taker to a secretary who is a corporate professional who performs an oversight function to increase the impact on the quality of governance. More and more, the board secretary is required to act as the corporate gatekeeper in charge of facilitating corporate governance, which is built on transparency and board independence. The corporate collapses of the late 1990s and the early 2000s and the various world recessions that the nations of the world have suffered have resulted nowadays in an increased stakeholder and shareholder focus on corporate governance and transparency. Therefore, nowadays, ladies and gentlemen, companies and directors are under more scrutiny and more pressure to remain accountable and to put meaningful corporate governance models in place. This is one of the reasons why the company or the board secretary's role has been heightened. Globally, therefore, nowadays, the board secretary is considered to be the chief governance specialist within an organization, increasingly relied upon to provide advice and to assist in the implementation of good governance practices and to help in building good governance cultures within institutions. We see now that the expectation is that the role is more proactive than the reactive role we have seen in the traditional instances of the previous decades. The gatekeeper can now be defined as a professional officer or a service provider of a company who verifies. I'm speaking now about the concept of the gatekeeper in corporate governance, whose role it is to verify the trustworthiness and the responsibility of the businesses of a company. The board secretary today is the duty bearer for the process of verification and the process of authentication, being the bearer of the company seal. The ancient seal, the 1957 seal of the Bank of Ghana, is here with me in my room as I speak, under tight lock, and it is only the secretary that applies the bank seal to authenticate all bank documents, including licenses, which we issue to those seeking to become banks, savings and loans companies, and other financial institutions. The board secretary is often the named representative on all legal documents, and so it is their core responsibility to ensure that the company and its directors operate and correspond primarily within the ambit of the law and within the ambit of the principles of good corporate governance. To this end, the board secretary is considered as a main gatekeeper of the legal and board affairs of the body corporate, and who works to enhance the standard of corporate governance in the body corporate. In Ghana, the company secretary is vested with the power to authenticate formal proceedings. And so it would be the secretary or the board secretary who will be required to execute all the official documents of the company, sometimes with the director or sometimes with the chairman, under the common seal. Generally, the board secretary can issue certified copies of company resolutions or board resolutions alongside with any directives and notices. You see a lot of the Bank of Ghana notices in the papers under the hand of the secretary, and this is the law that empowers the secretary to do so. Section 212 of the Act 992 for those who would like to read further. In gatekeeping, therefore, the board secretary is expected to center and to maintain the operations of the organization or the company within the framework of the principles and pillars of good corporate governance. This would be the fundamental principles of accountability, of fairness, of transparency, of responsibility, that processes have been participatory and consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive. As gatekeeper of the gate of good corporate governance, the board secretary is to advise on the principles of natural justice, which include the principles of audi alterum partem, which is the Latin principle in law, which says that let both sides be heard. It's the principle that assures fairness. And so before an employee is dismissed, for example, or if there was a labor dispute, then the board secretary is to advise the board to ensure that before a decision is made to dismiss, that the person involved has been given an opportunity to be heard, and that they themselves do not sit. And so if let's say the head of department sits as the same person on the disciplinary committee to discipline an employee who is deemed to have committed an offense against the rules or regulations, then that would not be fair under the principles, the administrative law principles of nemo judat in causa sua, which means that a man cannot be a judge in his own case. And so the board secretary must advise the board to make sure that all internal processes and procedures have been adhered to, and that fair hearings have been given, and that the hearings have been just, not only fair, but they've been just and equitable. And above all, that the company has observed and followed the rule of law in all of these duties. These are essential components of the board secretary's gatekeeping roles. In addition, the board secretary must ensure that the tenets of the King Report or the King Code have been adhered to. This code defines corporate governance as the exercise of ethical and effective leadership by the governing body. The King Report and the King Code is important because it is the code that sets out what ethical and effective leadership is, and it is highly recommended for decision makers. Seeing that the board is the apex institution that takes decisions, then it is incumbent upon the secretary of the board to advise the board and to bring some of these notions and principles and tenets of good cultural behaviors to the notice and attention of the board. The philosophy of the code consists of three key elements of leadership. We're talking about sustainability. We're also talking about good corporate citizenship. It holds views that good governance is essential for effective and ethical leadership. The code's view on corporate citizenship flows from a company standing as a jurisdiction, a juristic person or a legal entity. It is aimed at sustainable development and growth of companies. So it looks to achieve sustainable economic, social, and environmental performance and sustainability as primary moral and economic imperatives for companies in this century. The gatekeeping role, therefore, of the board secretary is a legal requirement, as I have stated. Not only the role of the board secretary, but the gatekeeping role itself is enshrined under the same section 212, which I referred to earlier. Key among it is its broad advisory role on all matters relevant to the affairs and the existence of the company. This is what the law says. And so in gatekeeping, the board secretary is to be a person of a broad understanding. And later on, when I look at the characteristics, you will see that it should be a person who has a command or a broad view of all the issues pertaining to the institution or the corporation or the company of which they have been appointed as secretary. I want to spend a little time looking, therefore, at the requirements and qualification for appointment as a board secretary. If the standard is elevated, then so should be the person who occupies that role. It is because of this new elevated and gatekeeping role of the board secretary that the new Act 2019, we still call it the new Act because the old Act ran from 1963 to 2019, departs substantially from the old Companies Act, and it prescribes the qualifying requirements which prospective board secretaries must satisfy before they are appointed as company secretaries. Under the old Companies Act, 1963 Act 179, Section 190, a person did not have to meet any particular strict qualifications or any particular requirements to be appointed as a board secretary. A company's board could simply appoint anybody whom they saw to be a fit person for the role. This still pertains in smaller companies. You'll find that somebody is called, here is our company secretary or our board secretary, who may not necessarily be a fit and proper person as described by the law. In this regard, most companies used to appoint persons and individuals without the requisite knowledge to adequately perform the role of the board secretary and the duties required. Of course, some of these companies faltered on their corporate compliance requirements as a result. There is no surprise there. This requirement is to ensure that only fit and property, this legal requirement or statutory requirement, is to ensure that only fit and proper persons are appointed to the office of the company secretary or the board secretary. And it is so pertinent to the notion of gatekeeping that companies are now required to appoint a company secretary duly qualified under Section 2113 of the Act to perform these duties. And should a company carry on a business for more than 6 months without a board secretary or a company secretary, that person, that company is liable to a penalty under the Act 992. And it is my belief and opinion that the retention of this requirement and the imposition of the penalty demonstrates the importance of the role of the board secretary in the eyes of the law, that matter of compliance, not only with legality, not only with the rules, but also with corporate governance affairs. Let us look now, therefore, to a few requirements and qualifications for appointment as a board secretary. The Act goes on to underscore the growing importance of the role by defining and prescribing the person's specification for a board secretary. And this is what it says. It says that the directors of a company shall not appoint a board secretary unless that person has obtained a professional qualification or a tertiary level qualification with an offering in company law practice and administration that enables the person to have the knowledge to perform the functions of the company secretary. They must make sure, the board must make sure that the person appointed as a secretary has been a secretary trainee or has held the office under a qualified company secretary for at least 3 years. They must be a member in good standing of the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators or the Institute of Chartered Accountants, or I will add the Ghana Bar Association, having been enrolled to practice and is in good standing as a barrister or solicitor in the Republic. By virtue of an academic qualification or as a member of a professional body, appears to the directors to be a person capable of performing the functions of the secretary of the company. You see, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished executive members of the IoD, that the appointment of a board secretary is a sine qua non for the business operations of any company in Ghana. And as I have indicated earlier, any company that dares to operate without 6 months, who comes to the notice of the law shall pay a penalty. A board secretary, therefore, nowadays cannot be a mere literate person who is employed by the company to run errands for the board and management of the company, or a person who is employed to serve as a servant of the board or to perform housekeeping duties during meetings of the board and management. The intent of the framers of the law in requiring specific professionals to be appointed as board secretary is informed by the gatekeeping role that the secretary will be required to perform, and the need to have a board secretary who has the required professional qualifications, the experience, the stature, the gravitas, and the clout to enable him or her to perform the gatekeeping role decisively, fairly, and independently. And the gravitas is important because you must be heard by a collective group of directors who themselves are highly qualified, highly experienced, and in most cases, if not all cases, excellent in their fields of endeavor, who have been pulled together to form a board. And so if you are advising them, then you must know that you cannot be a person who not only knows, but you must have that gravitas with which to address them and for them to take on board the advice that you have given them. In this slide, I want us to look at the current trends and key activities of the board secretary. Good corporate governance, as we have established, is a key modern role of the modern 21st century board secretary, who must ensure that the directors remain committed to the highest standards of corporate governance. The board secretary must monitor global developments. You must be a person who keeps yourself apprised and who keeps yourself updated on corporate governance issues. So to advise the board of directors, as I have said earlier, in applying these governance practices to meet the board's requirements and to meet all the stakeholders' expectation. The board secretary must monitor vital developments, therefore, in the field of corporate governance itself and with compliance, not only with the law. Often we are skewed towards the regulations and the law, but nowadays we are required to keep ourselves apprised in vital developments so as to update the directors on these improvements before the board meeting, during the board meeting, and even after the board meeting. The modern current board secretary will act as a bridge between the board of directors and the stakeholders on corporate governance issues and on building good relationships. The directors must be able to rely on the board secretary to provide the best advice and guidance on governance issues before decisions are made during meetings. On board development, I have stated here that all directors should have access to the advice and services of the board secretary. So you cannot be a board secretary who cannot engage. You should build effective working relationships with all board members. And the board secretary must strive to offer impartial advice, acting only in the best interest of the company. And in promoting board development, the board secretary is required to assist the chairman with all development processes, including the vital and crucial board evaluation, the board induction, and the continuous board training. The board secretary currently must ensure that they are implementing a rigorous annual board, committee, and individual director assessment and evaluation, ensuring that actions arising from previous reviews have been completed and adhered to. Induction and training I have spoken on. The board secretary should take the lead, is required to take the lead in developing tailored induction programs for new directors. New directors themselves, ladies and gentlemen, must themselves be brought up to speed regarding what the current trends are and what the current notions, not only on the law, but on matters of the pillars of corporate governance. And so a training program for individual directors and then for the general board is highly recommended. Although these tasks are ultimately the responsibility of the chairman of the board, the company secretary or the board secretary adds value, and this is the gatekeeping role, by fulfilling or